Welcome to video 5, people. There was an extra video this week. There was just a little bit more to cover with sampling there. Now, first things first, I am going to show you something that I was holding off on purpose. Mainly because I wanted you to get used to using the spectrum and actually knowing what a fundamental frequency was. So hopefully you have been playing around with samples since the last couple videos, and you might have run into a situation where you had to pitch down a sample because it wasn't in C. So a really quick way to find out what a sample actually is, instead of using the spectrum or cross-checking it by ear with the piano or whichever method you used, you scroll across to audio effects here and we click on this, scroll down, and you'll see we've got a tuner down here. What you can do is just drag this in after your instrument. And now if you play a key, I'm going to play C3 on my keyboard, so just show you in here. So I'm playing C3, which is the original sound. I haven't changed anything here. I'm just going to play this and just watch the tuner. So you can see the tuner's actually telling me that it's an F. Now, because it's a waveform, it might vary up and down very slightly, so it might quickly switch to an E or to an F sharp. But we can quite clearly see that it's holding on an F there for the majority. So we know that that sound is more than likely an F. And if we come over here, we can actually see that it is actually an F. So if you don't know what notes the original sound's playing and it's not in the name of the file, you can just use a tuner and make sure you're pressing the root note, so C3, and the tuner will actually tell you what note's being played. And then you can use that to reverse engineer it. And so we know that that's an F, so we'd have to transpose down 5. Fix that in here. And now we're playing a C. So you can see it does very briefly switch between notes. It will switch to whatever's either side of the note. Because it is a waveform, it's not a perfect tone, because especially this one being a saw. So it might think that for a split second that it's another note, but overall, just see what the dominant note is that's showing up on the tuner, and you can use that as a reference. Okay, so we've officially been introduced to sampling, and we went over what sampling is, how to use audio tracks in Ableton, and also how to use the simpler. One thing I'm quickly going to jump into here for this last video is what the sampler is. So if I just drag the sampler onto a fresh MIDI track, you'll see that it's essentially the same as a simpler. If I drag a simpler onto here, so simpler, sampler. So see, it's the same except that the sampler doesn't have those 3 options on the left, but it does have a lot more going on up the top here. So one thing that the sampler can do, which the simpler cannot, is something called multi-sampling. What multi-sampling is that you can actually assign different samples to different parts of the keyboard. So this is especially useful if you play an instrument of a note, like a note of an instrument, sorry. Let's say you play a C3 on a saxophone. In simpler, what you do is just drag that C3 in here, and then you'd play up and down the piano roll. So I'll just bring up something to give you an example. So I just dragged in this sample of a saxophone in. Let's just say this is C3. So you see as I move up and down, it's pitching up and down. Let me just warp this. But you can hear that as we drift further away from C3, I'll bring up a piano roll here. That's the original note, the original sound. See up here, it doesn't really sound like a saxophone anymore. It's kind of just this beep. And that's because the sample is losing its quality as it drifts further away from the original sound. Even here, that doesn't sound very realistic anymore. Starts to sound a little bit too electronic. I'm not sure how accurate this original sample was, but even if you had a genuinely recorded saxophone in there at C3, the further you get away from it, it's going to start to lose quality a little bit, and you can tell it's more electronic because there's only so much that Ableton can do with pitching up and down. So what the sampler allows you to do is so let's say you had that C3 saxophone, this one here, and drag that in here. You can see now when I've opened up this zone that it gives me this kind of bar which tells me where this sample is playing. So right now it's playing all across the board, and that little R is the root. So if I drag this back, what I can do is make it so that this sample here only plays from, let's say, C3 to C4, and then down to C2. And then what I can do is grab another saxophone that was recorded at C2, drag that in, or C1, drag it in here, and have that do the next 2 octaves. And then when you play that on your keyboard, it'll automatically switch to the different sample depending where you're playing here. So if you play down here, it'll automatically play this new sample. That way you can have high quality sampling, and it sounds a little more realistic when you can drop multiple octaves into something like this. So if you have access to different octaves of the same sound, definitely you can use the sampler, and then you can set it up like this so that the different samples only take up a little chunk of the keyboard, of the piano roll. That way when you go up and down the octaves, you're not trying to stretch this one sample all the way up to C8, down to C1 or whatever. You can also set up multi-sampling so that it triggers different sounds. You can almost make your own drum rack type of thing in here, and you can just trigger different sounds at different octaves or different notes even. You can really narrow it right down. So that's the real power of the sampler. Another thing I use the sampler for over the simpler is if I really want to pitch bend my sound further than what the simpler offers, in which case I jump over into MIDI here, and you can see this pitch bend range down the bottom, and you just crank that up to whatever you need. But we are going to cover this eventually anyway. But just so you're aware for now, there are a lot more options as you can see here, but we're not going to get into that now. I just wanted to sort of tell you what the sampler was so you weren't wondering what it was the whole time. So in essence, it's a slightly more advanced version of the simpler, but in 90% of your cases, you'll be able to get away with just using simpler for your tracks and for your sampling. So I hope everything we've gone through in this last week has been beneficial for you, has made sense, and that you're now able to use these techniques in your own tracks. One thing I do want to mention about sampling is try not to go too crazy with it. I mean, you can make an entire track just from samples without even using, like your own kits and sounds and that sort of stuff. I mean, many tracks are actually made completely out of samples. The point I'm trying to get across really is to use samples, but try and manipulate them so that you make them your own. Kind of like what I did here with this vocal, and what I did with this chord, how I took a stab and turned it into a chord. And same thing with this pluck. I think I just used that first little bit. But try not to drag, let's say, entire drum loops and entire melodies and basses just into audio tracks and then calling that a song. That's basically what I'm saying for you to avoid. Otherwise, you're not really making your own beats. You're not really putting your creativeness into it. You're kind of just taking what someone else has already made, and you're just gluing everyone else's creative ideas together, which is totally fine. As I said, it's not like it's illegal. You're allowed to do it. But I do encourage you to be as unique as you can, as creative as you can, and see if you can twist samples into a way that makes it your own. I mean, especially with a lot of those Kashmir packs, I've heard so many samples in different songs, and people have just taken the sample and just thrown it in their track. And I can pretty much spot straight away which sample they're using. It's refreshing when I hear sounds that I've never heard before, even if they are from samples that are overly used. But yeah, just a little side note on that. So homework for this week is quite self-explanatory again. Feel free to go crazy with sampling this week. I want to see what you guys can come up with. And make sure you use different instances of simpler in those different modes. Like you can use it in slice, one shot, classic, for different sounds. just to recap again, you know, classic, you can use it as chords. So you can go pitch it up and down the piano roll. For one shots is mostly for drums and that sort of stuff, but it can be used anywhere. And then slice if you've got a long loop full of like a drum loop or a chord loop, melody loop, that way you can chop it up. If you want to, like I did here, you can just throw in the sample straight into an audio track, and then you can play around with the transpose, the warp modes. You can even stretch this out if you want to. So if I made this one here twice as long, that can also be another way to change the sample. So the way I'm doing this is I'm holding shift, and you'll see when I move my mouse up to here and hold shift, that it actually adds this little arrow to the bracket. When it does that, you know you're actually stretching the sample, as opposed to trying to drag it out or in. If I hold this, you'll see I'm compressing it. So another little technique there. But that was this week's theme, was sampling, so I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got a lot out of it. And yeah, feel free to go nuts with it. Next week, we're going to be taking a look at the audio effects section for the first time. And I'm going to be introducing you to a few of the commonly used ones and how to use those as well. So enjoy your week, enjoy your weekend, and I'll catch you next time.